listening to another boring bedtime story by the campfire. Sleep well.
In the early morning hours of January 15th, 1919, Boston awakened to an unusually warm winter day. The temperature had risen dramatically overnight, melting the snow that had blanketed the city for weeks. Steam rose gently from the cobblestone streets as the sun climbed higher into the crisp New England sky. The north end of Boston was already bustling with activity. Workers made their way to the waterfront, their breath visible in small puffs as they walked along Commercial Street. The familiar sounds of the harbor filled the air, ships' horns echoing across the water, the creaking of wooden docks, and the steady rhythm of footsteps on wet pavement. At 529 Commercial Street stood an enormous steel tank rising 50 feet into the morning air. This massive structure contained over 2 million gallons of dark, thick molasses, sticky and sweet, waiting to be processed into rum and industrial alcohol. The tank had been built hastily during the war years when demand for these products had soared. The molasses inside the tank was especially thick on this January morning, like dark honey that had been left to sit in a cool pantry. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, responding to the changing temperature with the patience of centuries-old tree sap. The warmth of the unusual weather was beginning to affect the massive volume of liquid within. Nearby, children played in the streets before school, their laughter carrying on the mild winter breeze. They built small snowmen from the remaining patches of snow, unaware that this day would become forever etched in the memory of their city. Their voices mixed with the sounds of horses' hooves clicking against the stones and the distant whistle of a train approaching North Station. The Italian families who had made the North End their home were beginning their daily routines. Mothers hung laundry on lines strung between tenement buildings, the fabric fluttering gently in the warm air. Fathers prepared for another day of work at the docks, in the factories, or in the small shops that lined the narrow streets. In nearby Copp's Hill, old trees swayed gently in the unseasonably warm breeze. Their bare branches created intricate patterns against the pale winter sky, like delicate lacework drawn by an unseen hand. The cemetery at the hill's summit held the stories of Boston's earliest settlers, their weathered headstones standing as silent witnesses to the city's long history. The harbor sparkled in the morning light, its dark waters reflecting the sky like a mirror. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries mixing with the sounds of the awakening city. Ships of various sizes dotted the water, some preparing to depart for distant ports, others arriving with cargo from across the Atlantic. Inside the Great Molasses tank, the thick liquid had been warming throughout the night. The steel walls, painted dark green, absorbed the heat from the unusual January thaw. Deep within the molasses, tiny bubbles began to form, so small they could barely be seen, like the first signs of fermentation in a vintner's barrel. The Purity Distilling Company had built the tank quickly, responding to wartime demands. The rivets that held the massive steel plates together had been installed with efficiency rather than perfection in mind. Each rivet was like a small button holding together the seams of this industrial garment, bearing tremendous weight and pressure. Workers at the nearby fire station were polishing their brass equipment, the metal gleaming like gold in the morning sunlight. The horses in their stalls nickered softly, sensing the change in weather. Everything felt different on this January day, as if the city itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. The molasses continued its slow, invisible dance within the tank. Currents moved through the thick liquid like underwater rivers, carrying warmth from the outer walls toward the center.
The surface remained calm, giving no hint of the forces building beneath its dark, mirror-like appearance. In the tenement windows, curtains fluttered as mothers opened them to let in the fresh, warm air. The unusual weather felt like a gift after the harsh winter months. Children pressed their faces against the glass, eager to spend time outdoors before the cold returned, as everyone knew it surely would. The elevated railway carried its passengers above the streets, the train cars swaying gently on their tracks like boats on calm water. From the windows, riders could see the Great Molasses tank standing among the other industrial structures that defined this part of Boston's landscape. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps with slow, methodical movements, preparing for another day of business. The rhythmic sound of their brooms against the pavement created a gentle percussion that mixed with the city's morning symphony. Dust motes danced in the slanted rays of sunlight that fell between the buildings.
The molasses tank stood like a sleeping giant among the smaller buildings of the North End. Its curved walls rose in a perfect circle, holding within them enough sweet liquid to fill an Olympic swimming pool many times over. The morning sun cast long shadows from its bulk across the surrounding streets and buildings. Deep in the harbor, fish swam in the dark water, unaware of the human activity above. Their movements were fluid and graceful, following ancient patterns that had guided their kind for thousands of years. The water itself seemed to pulse with life, responding to tides that had been flowing since time began. The warming air began to create small convection currents within the molasses tank. Like invisible tornadoes moving through honey, these currents stirred the thick liquid in ways that couldn't be seen from the outside. The molasses responded to the temperature change with the slow inevitability of a glacier beginning to move. In the nearby streets, delivery wagons made their rounds, their wheels creating gentle rhythms against the cobblestones. Horses walked with patient steps, their hooves finding familiar paths through the neighborhood they knew by heart. The drivers called out greetings to shopkeepers and residents, their voices warm and familiar. The steel of the great tank expanded ever so slightly in the warming air. Metal has its own way of breathing, growing larger in heat and contracting in cold, following laws of physics as reliable as the sunrise. Each steel plate adjusted to the changing temperature in its own time and manner. Children gathered around a small puddle formed by melting snow, watching their reflections waver in the water. They threw small pebbles to see the ripples spread outward in perfect circles, each one growing larger until it reached the edges and disappeared. Their laughter echoed off the brick walls of the surrounding buildings. The molasses within the tank had reached a critical point in its warming process. What had been thick as cold honey was now becoming more fluid, more active, more responsive to forces that had been building throughout the night. Pressure was mounting in ways that the human eye could never detect. In offices throughout the city, clerks were beginning their work for the day, their pen nibs scratching against paper as they recorded the business of a growing metropolis. The sound of their writing was like gentle rain on leaves, steady and comforting in its predictability. The sun climbed higher, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the North End. Windows caught the light and reflected it back in brilliant flashes, like mirrors sending signals across the urban landscape. The city seemed to shimmer in the unusual warmth of the January morning. Steam rose from sewers and drains as the snow melt found its way into the underground channels that carried water away from the streets.
The vapor created small ghostly clouds that appeared and vanished in moments, like spirits of winter saying their farewells. The pressure within the molasses tank continued to build with each passing minute. The thick liquid was transforming from a solid mass into something more dynamic, more alive, more dangerous. Yet from the outside, nothing appeared to have changed at all. Workers at the nearby Boston Elevated Railway were checking their equipment, ensuring that the trains would run smoothly throughout the day. Their movements were practiced and efficient, following routines that had been perfected over years of service to the growing city. In the harbor, tugboats pushed barges loaded with cargo toward the docks. Their engines chugged steadily, creating small wakes that spread outward in V-shaped patterns behind them. The water accepted these disturbances and smoothed itself back to calmness within moments. The rivets holding the molasses tank together were now bearing more stress than their builders had anticipated. Each one was like a small soldier holding the line against mounting pressure, standing firm but beginning to feel the strain of forces beyond their original design specifications. Families in nearby apartments were preparing breakfast, the aromas of coffee and baking bread beginning to fill the air. These familiar scents mixed with the salt breeze from the harbor to create the distinctive atmosphere that made the North End feel like home to its residents.
The molasses tank stood surrounded by smaller buildings, like a giant among houses built for regular-sized people. Its presence dominated the skyline in this part of the city, visible from blocks away and serving as a landmark for those who knew the neighborhood well. Deep within the tank, the warming molasses was beginning to create its own weather system. Currents of different temperatures moved past each other like atmospheric fronts, creating instabilities that would have been fascinating to observe if anyone had been able to see them. The elevated train tracks gleamed in the morning sunlight, their steel rails reflecting light like silver ribbons stretched across the urban landscape. The regular passage of trains had polished them to a bright finish that caught every ray of sun that managed to penetrate between the buildings. Children's voices could be heard from a nearby schoolyard as they played before classes began. Their games created a joyful counterpoint to the more serious sounds of adult activity surrounding them. Innocence and industry existed side by side in the complex symphony of city life. The warming air was causing the molasses to expand, and with expansion came movement. What had been still was now in motion, creating pressures and forces that the tank's builders had never fully considered. Change was occurring at the molecular level, invisible but inexorable. Shop owners cranked down their awnings to protect their windows from the bright morning sun. The canvas fluttered gently in the mild breeze, creating patches of shade that shifted and danced as the fabric moved. Patterns of light and shadow played across the sidewalks like living artwork. In the distance, church bells began to chime the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the rooftops and mingling with the sounds of commerce and daily life. Each bell had its own tone and character, contributing to a melody that had marked time in this city for generations. The steel plates of the molasses tank were now expanding at different rates, creating stresses along the seam lines where they had been riveted together. Each connection point was experiencing forces that tested the craftsmanship of wartime construction, when speed had often taken precedence over perfection. Mothers called to their children from tenement windows, their voices carrying love and concern across the morning air. The sound of family connections being maintained created a warm counterpoint to the more mechanical sounds of the awakening industrial district. The molasses continued its invisible transformation, becoming more liquid, more mobile, more capable of movement. Forces were building that would soon demand release, like water behind a dam that was slowly weakening under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. Horse-drawn carriages moved through the streets with gentle, rhythmic sounds that had been part of city life for centuries. The clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones created a percussion that connected this modern industrial age to older, simpler times when the pace of life moved more slowly. The great tank's shadow shifted slightly as the sun continued its arc across the sky. Within that shadow, the temperature remained cooler, creating a gradient that added to the complex forces acting upon the structure and its contents. Every detail of the environment contributed to the mounting pressure. Workers began arriving at the various businesses that surrounded the tank, their conversations and footsteps adding to the growing chorus of daily activity. None of them suspected that this January day would become one that would never be forgotten in the history of their city. The molasses had now reached a state where its consistency was more like thick syrup than the solid mass it had been during the cold winter months. This change in viscosity meant that it could flow more readily, respond more quickly to pressure, and move with greater force if given the opportunity. Steam locomotives whistled in the distance as they approached or departed from North Station, their calls echoing across the urban landscape like the voices of iron giants. The sound spoke of journeys beginning and ending, of connections being made across the vast network of rails that tied the nation together. The morning light caught the rivets on the molasses tank, making them gleam like buttons on a giant's coat. Each one was holding back tremendous forces, standing as small guardians against pressures that were mounting with each passing minute of the warming day. Children walked to school in small groups, their books strapped together with leather bands, their voices creating a joyful babble that spoke of youth and possibility. They passed the great tank without giving it much thought, as it had become simply part of the landscape of their daily lives. The harbor water lapped gently against the docks and pilings, creating a sound like whispered conversations between the sea and the land. Seaweed swayed in the underwater currents, moving in ancient rhythms that had preceded human settlement by millions of years. Inside the tank, the molasses had developed definite currents and flows, invisible rivers of thick liquid moving in response to temperature differences and pressure variations. The mass was no longer static, but had become dynamic, alive with internal movement and energy. The warming air carried scents from the harbor, the bakeries, the stables, and the various industries that made the North End their home. These aromas blended together to create the unique olfactory signature of this part of Boston, familiar and comforting to those who lived and worked here. Office workers in nearby buildings were settling into their daily routines, unaware that they were about to witness an event that would be talked about for generations. Their pens moved across ledgers and documents, recording the ordinary business of an extraordinary day. The steel tank continued to expand in the warming air, its molecular structure responding to the heat in ways that created microscopic changes with macroscopic consequences. Each degree of temperature rise brought new stresses and new challenges to the integrity of the structure. Delivery men wheeled their carts through the streets, their wheels creating gentle rumbling sounds against the cobblestones. Their cargo of goods and supplies represented the economic lifeblood of the city, flowing along established routes like blood through arterial pathways. The molasses was now warm enough to flow more freely than it had in months. What had been thick as cold tar was becoming mobile, responsive, dangerous. The tank that contained it was holding back a force that was growing stronger with each passing minute. In apartments and tenements throughout the North End, families were beginning their daily routines, unaware that this Wednesday would interrupt the normal pattern of their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The familiar was about to become extraordinary. The sun's rays struck the curved wall of the molasses tank, heating the steel and transferring that warmth to the contents within. This solar energy was adding to the forces already at work, contributing to a situation that was rapidly approaching a critical point. Shopkeepers arranged their displays in windows and doorways, creating attractive presentations of their wares for the day's customers. Their careful arrangements spoke of pride in craftsmanship and hope for prosperity, normal concerns of normal people on what seemed like a normal day. The elevated railway carried its passengers above the streets, the regular rhythm of the train wheels on the tracks creating a percussion that had become part of the urban soundscape. From their elevated position, riders could look down on the great tank and the surrounding buildings without sensing any danger. Deep within the molasses, pressure was building like water behind a weakening dam. The thick liquid was no longer content to remain still, but was beginning to push against the walls that contained it, testing the strength of rivets that were already strained beyond their design limits. Children played hopscotch on the sidewalks, their laughter mixing with the more serious sounds of adult activity. Their games followed ancient patterns, unchanged despite the industrial transformation that had reshaped their neighborhood around them. The warming molasses began to create small bubbles within its mass, tiny pockets of gas that rose slowly toward the surface like miniature balloons struggling through honey. These bubbles were signs of fermentation of chemical processes that were adding to the internal pressure of the tank. Workers at the fire station were checking their equipment, ensuring that their brass fittings gleamed and their leather hoses were properly maintained. Their dedication to preparedness would soon be put to the ultimate test in ways they could never have anticipated. The great tank stood like a sleeping volcano, giving no external sign of the forces building within. Its dark green paint showed no stress. Its curved walls appeared solid and secure, yet inside, conditions were approaching a point of no return. Horse-drawn fire engines stood ready in their stations, their brass bells polished to perfection, their hoses coiled with military precision. These magnificent machines represented the finest in emergency response technology, though they would soon face a challenge unlike any they had been designed to meet. The molasses continued its transformation from solid to liquid, from stable to dynamic, from contained to explosive. Each molecule was responding to the heat, expanding, moving, creating chains of cause and effect that would soon reach their inevitable conclusion. In the harbor, fishing boats prepared for another day on the water, their nets mended and ready, their engines warmed and tested. The sea promised its usual abundance, unaware that the land would soon provide its own kind of wave, dark and sweet and devastatingly powerful. The rivets holding the tank together were now stretched to their limits, each one bearing more weight and pressure than it had been designed to handle. They stood like small soldiers against overwhelming odds, brave but ultimately insufficient for the forces they faced. Children gathered around corners, their breath visible in small puffs despite the warming air. They shared stories and jokes, creating the bonds of friendship that would help them remember this day for the rest of their lives, though not for the reasons they might have expected. The molasses tank's shadow continued to shift as the sun climbed higher, but the warmth was now penetrating even the shaded areas. The entire structure was heating up, expanding, creating stress points that had never existed during the cold winter months when the tank had seemed so stable and secure. Delivery wagons made their rounds, their drivers calling out familiar greetings to shopkeepers and residents. These daily interactions created the social fabric that held the neighborhood together, connections that would prove vital in the hours and days to come. The harbor sparkled in the strengthening sunlight, its surface broken by the gentle movements of boats and the wake patterns they created.
The water seemed peaceful and eternal, following tidal rhythms that had existed long before the city and would continue long after current concerns had been forgotten. Inside the great tank, the molasses had reached a critical state of fluidity and pressure. What had been contained was now seeking escape, pushing against every weakness in the structure that held it, testing every rivet, every seam, every joint in the massive container. The sounds of the city created a complex symphony that morning, with contributions from horses' hooves, train wheels, children's laughter, mothers' calls, and the distant sounds of the harbor. This music of daily life was about to be interrupted by a sound unlike any Boston had ever heard. Workers in nearby buildings were absorbed in their tasks, their attention focused on ledgers and documents, on meetings and correspondence, on the normal business of a growing city. Their concentration would soon be broken by an event that would demand the attention of the entire world. The steel plates of the tank were now expanding at their maximum rate, creating stresses along every joint and connection point. The structure was being pushed beyond its design limits by forces that its builders had never fully understood or anticipated. Steam rose from the warming streets as the last of the snow melted and ran toward drains and sewers. The city was shedding its winter coat, revealing the underlying structure that had been hidden beneath layers of ice and snow for months. The molasses had become a liquid under pressure, seeking release through any weakness it could find in its containment. Invisible forces were building toward an explosion of sweetness that would transform the landscape and the lives of everyone in its path. In apartments throughout the North End, mothers were preparing lunch for their families, their kitchens filled with the aromas of cooking food. These domestic scenes of normal life were about to be interrupted by an event that would make this Wednesday unlike any other in Boston's history. The great tank stood like a time bomb, its countdown invisible to those who passed beneath its shadow. The rivets that held it together were stretched to their breaking point, ready to surrender to forces they had never been designed to contain. Children walked to school with their books and lunch pails, following routes they had traveled hundreds of times before. Their familiarity with these streets would serve them well in the confusion that was about to descend upon their neighborhood. The morning sun continued to warm the air and everything it touched, including the massive steel structure that held 2 million gallons of thick, sweet molasses. Each ray of sunshine was contributing to a situation that was rapidly approaching its moment of release. Workers at various businesses were settling into their daily routines, checking inventory, serving customers, and maintaining the equipment that kept their operations running smoothly. Their normal concerns were about to be overwhelmed by circumstances that none of them could have predicted. The molasses within the tank had now reached a state where it was actively pushing against its container, seeking escape through any available opening. The pressure was mounting toward a level that the tank's construction simply could not withstand. In the harbor, tugboats worked to position barges and ships, their engines creating small wakes that spread outward in perfect geometric patterns. The water accepted these disturbances and smoothed itself back to calmness, demonstrating a resilience that the nearby steel tank was about to lose. The elevated railway carried its passengers above the streets, providing them with a bird's-eye view of the neighborhood that was about to be transformed. Their elevated position would prove advantageous when the street level became impassable within a matter of minutes. Shopkeepers were greeting their first customers of the day, engaging in the pleasant small talk that lubricated the mechanisms of commerce. These normal human interactions were taking place in the shadow of a structure that was about to fail catastrophically. The rivets holding the molasses tank together were now bearing more stress than they had ever been designed to handle. Each one was a point of failure in a system that was rapidly approaching the moment when failure would become inevitable. Children played in small groups near their schools and homes, their games following patterns that had been passed down through generations.
Their innocence and joy created a poignant contrast to the industrial danger that loomed nearby, invisible but inexorable. The warming air was creating convection currents within the molasses tank, stirring the thick liquid in ways that added to the mounting pressure. These invisible movements were like the preliminary tremors before an earthquake, warning signs that went unnoticed and unheeded. Workers at the fire station were maintaining their equipment with the pride and precision that marked professional firefighters throughout the city. Their dedication to preparedness would soon be put to a test that would challenge every skill and resource they possessed. The Great Molasses tank stood in the morning sunlight, its dark green paint giving no hint of the drama unfolding within. Like a sleeping giant about to awaken, it held forces that would soon reshape the landscape of Boston's North End in ways that would be remembered for generations. The harbor continued its eternal dance with the tides, accepting ships and boats with the same patient grace it had shown for centuries. The water seemed to embody permanence and stability, qualities that were about to be tested by an unprecedented disaster originating on land. Deep within the tank, the molasses had reached the critical point where its desire for freedom could no longer be contained. 2 million gallons of thick, sweet liquid were about to break free from their confinement and surge into the streets of Boston with the force of a tidal wave. The morning sun climbed higher into the clear January sky, its warmth continuing to heat the steel and the molasses within the great tank. Each minute brought new thermal energy to a situation that was already balanced on the edge of catastrophe. In offices and shops throughout the North End, people were absorbed in their work, their attention focused on the tasks and concerns of daily life. None of them suspected that they were living through the final moments before an event that would become one of the most unusual and devastating industrial accidents ever recorded. The stage was set, the forces were in motion, and the moment of release was at hand. And then at 20 minutes past noon on that unusually warm January day, the inevitable happened, and Boston would never be quite the same again.